Welcome to the Table Leadership Podcast, where everyone is invited to pull up a seat, and all leaders have a voice to contribute to the conversation. We're glad you could join us today. And now, your host, Cyon Edgerton.
Oh, well, I love it. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You gotta love it when friends redecorate.
The rest of my house is under significant remodel and construction, so this is one of the few places where I can, this is one of two rooms in the house where I can close the door. And out of the rest of the choices is the other one that doesn't have boxes in any of the rooms.
So this is your one option for a good
my one option
for a good audio-visual podcast. That's great.
Yes. Yeah. So do you post the video of this, or is it just how you're recording?
I do on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have the audio podcast that goes out in all of the places. And then we have a YouTube channel where we post the video as well.
Good to know.
Yeah. And so I'll make sure that you get all of that stuff. When the time comes, I'll send you the links if you want to blast it. And then we also put together a little clip, a little excerpt for social media, to say, hey, this is our new podcast coming out. And so you'll get a copy of all of that stuff for your own benefit.
Good.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't we dive in and start off just by having you introduce yourself to all of our listeners and just kind of let us know a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you do, whatever you feel like would be significant and pertinent for people to get to know your heart.
Okay, sure thing. I'm Bronwyn Lea. I'm originally from South Africa, where I was born and raised, and I have been living in the States for 16 years now. It's the longest now that I've ever lived in one place. I started out my career thinking I would go into law, then went into marketing for a while, but I have landed up wearing a number of different hats, both in ministry and in local community leadership. So my current roles include being a freelance writer and a write-at-home mom, because I'm still a person on the PTA and coordinating committees and responding to the Scout emails and the food drives and doing the homework. But I am also a part-time pastor at my local church, and I am the editor and curator of an online ministry resource for a couple of hours a week. So lots of different hats. And most recently, a published author. So that's been a fun journey.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely talk about that. What is the online resource that you were just mentioning and referring to? What is that you're part of?
Okay, so I work with Propel Women, a women's ministry headed up by Christine Kane, when we work to equip and empower women, help them find their passion, purpose, and potential. The area that I work in is heading up Propel Sophia, which is one of our 2 weekly articles that we do. And what Propel Sophia does is its emphasis. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And we want to give worked examples of awesome women explaining how God's word is at work in their world and sharing their how-to, like boots on the ground application of faith in practice. What does it look like in leadership? What does it look like in finances? What does it look like in relational decision making? And them not just telling us the answer of how we should be doing this, but explaining their reasoning so we can learn from other people's process. I really love it. I think it's a great resource.
That's awesome. And if somebody wanted to get connected with that, where would be the best place for them to go?
propelwoman.org. Yeah,
okay.
There's a weekly newsletter that Propel Woman sends out, and every week's articles are tagged at the bottom of every newsletter. It's packed full of content. It's good stuff.
Perfect. Okay, and we'll include that in the show notes too for everyone that's listening who's interested. We'll make sure we include a link for that. And so you can go to the show notes and click right over to propelwoman.org and get all sorts of great stuff. I'm really familiar with the work that Propel does, and I've followed it for years, and I love all the resources and content that you guys put out. So
it's exciting stuff.
It is. It really is. And so you mentioned that you've been in the U.S. for 16 years now. What originally brought you over?
I married a guy. How many stories start like that? I was doing ministry in South Africa. I met a boy, and he said he wanted to do his PhD. And then it turned out his PhD was going to be a continuation of work that he'd done at UC Berkeley. And so we moved to California. And I thought we would just be here for 3 to 5 years while he finished that up. But nope, 15, 16 years and 3 children later. God is full of surprises.
Yes, he is. And so how often do you get to go back home?
It's really far to go back. And packing children, it's really expensive. So not as often as we would like. But I would say we have probably been able to connect in person with our family every 18 months to 2 years. A lot of our family don't actually live in South Africa anymore.
Okay.
We have family in Europe and family in Australia. And so sometimes they've come to see us, or sometimes we've met at some other place. As everybody gets very, very global and scattered.
Yep.
The great thing about being an adult, though, is we've been at the ages where babies are being born and people are getting married, and that gives you a really good excuse to go and hang out with people.
Exactly.
And everybody will be together because the cousin's getting married, and that's been fun.
Right. That's great. Yeah, my family's super global as well. And that was one of the first points that you and I connected on. Learning community when we met was, I said, oh my gosh, I know your accent. My family lived in South Africa for a while, and we got to go and visit multiple times and just absolutely fell in love. And I don't know, obviously you lived there for so long, so it might feel a little different, but at least from the few times that we were in South Africa and mainly in the Cape Town area, we have loved living in Northern California because Mike and I both say all the time, this feels like the closest thing climate-wise to South Africa that we've ever experienced. And, it's beautiful. We've kind of got the rolling hills, but we're also on the water. And so living in Northern California, I think for us is about as close to South Africa as it gets, because we absolutely...
Cape Town, yep. Certainly as close to Cape Town. There's a lot of overlap. I remember driving down Highway 1 for the first time, sort of south of San Francisco, and thinking, oh, this is eerie. This is eerie. This is just like this very famous drive called Chapman's Peak Drive in Cape Town. Thinking, wow.
Yeah, it feels just like it, doesn't it? Yeah. So we love that. Every time we went to Cape Town, we just kept praying, like, look, there's got to be some reason for us to live in South Africa. There's got to be some reason for you to send us here. And then he sent us to Northern California. So your
life's not finished yet. You may still end up there.
There's still time. I will absolutely receive that prophetic word in faith for sure. All right. So, so now I'm really curious to hear what you have to say to the next question I have, which is kind of my icebreaker that I ask to everyone because I have two great passions in life, food and leadership. And so the question I always ask is, if we were gathering a group of leaders around a table to pour into them and invest in them, and we were actually live and in person before we actually got to the good leadership stuff, what would you be feeding us?
Ice cream.
That is definitely the first time that I got that response. Okay, ice cream. Why ice cream?
We make it. We make homemade ice cream. It was something we got into. My husband has become very interested in meat and smoked meat and pulled pork, and so he would definitely be doing something fancy on the barbecue with, great carnitas, and he's been making bacon lately.
Okay.
Which, smoking it from scratch. That's what he would be doing. What I would be doing is taking care of the ice cream. We bought an ice cream maker. It was like a summer bucket list thing a couple of years. We borrowed somebody's ice cream machine and we thought, let's try this. And it became just a thing that we were doing. And it's now become one of the things we're known for. Like we're the house with ice cream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. I love it. Yep. That's definitely a first. The ice cream answer is a first. I love it. I feel like this is now it would give my children the impetus to get into leadership when I tell them, guys.
That's right. You'll get more ice cream. And the beautiful thing about making ice cream at home by yourself is that you can make things for people who wouldn't ordinarily have it. I can make sugar-free ice cream. I can make dairy-free ice cream. It has given us the freedom to include a bunch of people who always have to skip dessert.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I love it. I definitely want to sit at your leadership table now. For sure. Okay. So then once we actually get down to the good stuff, which obviously includes the ice cream, because let's face it, that's good stuff. What is it that you feel like in this season that you bring to the leadership table?
That's a great question. I would say two things. One of them is just a very broad variety of cultural and ecumenical experience. I have, at this point, not because I was church hopping, but just because life has hopped me around, been a kid who was in Catholic school, in a charismatic church, in a Methodist youth group in a very reformed college ministry, who went to an Anglican seminary, who works for a Baptist church, and now serves on a multicultural and multi-church ministry. And having worshipped and taught in multiple different countries at this point, there's something really cool about seeing different expressions of faith all over the world and seeing what's the same, which is deeply comforting, that both over time and space, God has been at work in his church. That's a really great comfort to continue to offer people. And also to see how things are different, which helps me to encourage people to hold things a little bit more loosely. It's the whole potted plant analogy. Like, if you bring someone a potted plant, we need to know which is the plant, which is the life, and which is the packaging it comes in. And I think that the cultural edge allows me to say, well, that part's the gospel, the plant, and the pot, maybe there are other ways that you can package this. So that's the one thing. Much more recently, though, I think the thing that I bring to the table is a conversation about how men and women do leadership together. Because I've been thinking about that, not just as a woman at the table, and how do I use my voice, and is it okay for me to be at the table? Because those answers differ depending on your church context or your leadership context. And we have self-doubt, and we self-select out, or other people, will mansplain me at the table. I don't like that. And communities suffer when not all voices are heard. But then what does it look like if we are people of faith, to lead with integrity and to include men and women in that conversation in a way that honors everybody's voices? And I have been increasingly thinking about what that looks like, particularly from a family point of view. If we are in a particularly Christian context, then we need to function like brothers and sisters with one another, and then everybody gets to talk at the table. Like, brothers and sisters all get to participate in the family meal. And we all get to cheer one another on. And I'm interested in encouraging that mindset, which is less business-like and more everybody belongs and gets to share their highs and lows or their ideas or whatever. And that is actually a leadership thing. That's not just a belonging and participation thing, but it's a way of looking at everyone's right to be there and valuing their voice.
That's so good. I have so many questions, and so we're just going to process through some of them. So I want to go back to, you talked about how you have this diversity of experience, and I loved, as you're listing off all of the different expressions of faith that you've kind of experienced throughout your life. You talked about how what's comforting is seeing what's the same. When you're operating cross-culturally and also cross-denominationally. What are some of those things that you have noticed that kind of, no matter where you go, no matter who you're worshiping with, these are some of the things that are the same, and it's just comforting? What are just a couple of those?
I think realizing that people pray all over the world reminds me that God hears all over the world. And that is comforting for me to know that my prayers, like, I have family overseas and causes that I care about that I physically, literally can do nothing about. But having worshipped in those communities, I know that God is there and that he's listening, and that I can pray here and he will act there. And that he is powerful and able to do those things. So it's really great to remember that, and this was the problem that Israel ran into in the Old Testament, is they kept on thinking that God was a territorial God and that he would just work in Israel. But that if you traveled around, you needed somewhere else. And the big lesson of the whole exile is that they landed up in Babylon, and God is like, hey, I'm God here too. Look, let me send you some visions to show you that I'm here. And so that's one of the things that I think travel does, is it reminds me that God is global. The other thing is that Jesus saves. He really does. And that there might be different ways that we invite people into faith, from catechisms and very formal teaching to mass rallies where we invite people into tearful altar calls. And in a way, the method, or you could be in the Middle East and people have Jesus come to them a dream and they seek out a safe person to tell them the story. God is so creative in the way that he calls people to himself, and it's the same salvation everywhere we go. I love that those two things are true.
That's so good. I love that. And so then on the flip side of that, when we talk about the differences, and oh my goodness, there's so many differences and so many things. And unfortunately, oftentimes those differences can be so divisive and
Right.
instead of, uniting us. What is it? I won't ask, what those differences are, because I think we all know, between cultures, between denominations, what some of the differences are, the stakes and the ground that unfortunately, we kind of, the hills that we tend to live and die on when really it doesn't matter that much. But because you have such this wide array of experience, and because you do worship with and teach to and relate with and lead with people from so many different expressions, what is it that you've learned about making space for that? What wisdom can you offer in just making space for those differences and still operating from a place of unity and love?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think that if I was to choose one thing, it would have to do with language. Now, part of this is because I'm a word nerd, so I notice these things, but it is probably a thread that I've noticed throughout. So one of them is that I think when we're trying to parse truth and figure out, particularly when things feel threatening or under debate, one of the ways that we protect the gospel or protect orthodoxy is that we become very particular about which words are used. They're like markers of who's in and who's out. Are you this type of Baptist? Are you that type? Do you believe this? Do you believe that? And if people say the wrong word, or if they don't say the word that we were hoping that they would say, we have question marks about their faith. And I think one of the things that travel has made me realize is that every little culture has their theological safe words. And I can hold mine a little bit more loosely, because now I've lived in enough communities with that have been theologically safe, but had different words, to realize that there's variety and people are still holding to the gospel. At the same time, as someone who is trying to speak and do ministry in a broader community than just my own, that also means I must be very careful about language. And that in my desire to be clear and specific, I need to choose words that aren't, to the best of my knowledge, triggering to certain communities. And so some of that means testing your words with a number of different hearers and saying, how does this sound to you? When I say this, does this come across as concerning? And trying to be as specific and as clear and as broad, so that we're not raising flags for people with our language unnecessarily. We do a lot of this with online writing. And leadership is actually one of the things that we want to be careful about, because there are a number of people who don't self-identify as leaders because they live in cultures where they haven't been allowed to be leaders, or that's seen as grasping power or feels disingenuous. But they're happy with influence. They realize they have influence even if they don't have power. And so choosing when and where we use those words so that we're still equipping people has been an interesting thing to think about.
That's really interesting. I'm a word nerd too, and so I just love that idea about language and the words that we use and how they can be triggering. And I'm just thinking about some of the different experiences that I've had in the past in my leadership and some of the different churches that I've been part of, even just here in the US, not even going to kind of the global church, and how much humility it requires to be able to say, I love you so much and I care enough about you that I am going to be willing to, like you said, hold loosely or lay down some of the things that I may feel very strongly and passionate and even excited about, because I want you to hear my heart more than you hear my personal theology or my denomination or my culture. I want you to hear the heart of God more than anything else.
Yeah, that's where the fruit of the Spirit carries over, because no matter what words you're using, we can tell when people are being kind and gentle and self-controlled and patient with us. Those things translate culturally every time.
Yeah. For someone who maybe has a very local context, who doesn't have the opportunity to maybe do as much traveling, whether it's globally or even just within their own country, for someone who has a local context, but who says, I still have a heart for this, and I still want to be unifying, and I want to be honoring, and I want to hold space for what they might define as the other. What are some of the ways that we can enter into that, even just in our local context? How do we kind of establish a broader, more global worldview and understanding of faith and leadership and all of these things when we still have a very local context?
Oh, that's a superb question. Most of my work is in a really local context.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the pastoral staff of my local church and a leader in my local home group. And so as far as they're concerned, my national writing doesn't exist. While life is lived with real people who we bump into in the grocery store and snag their parking spots in the park at the local strip mall. So it does feel very local that way. I think that moving towards an idea that our communities are large families does a lot of work in this regard, because it allows us to see our connectedness to people beyond our nuclear families, and it gives us a tone of voice that we speak to one another around. And all of us, even if have lived in one town all of our lives, have cousins and family reunions, and we understand the idea of family that we're connected to, even if we don't live in the same city. And then you might get together all at Thanksgiving. But there's kind of a gentleness in one's heart towards your cousins that you only see once every 10 years, once a year or once every 10 years. And even if you don't do day-to-day life with them, you're still aware that they're part of the family. And I think that when we move into more ministry context, that kind of idea, this is my local family, but I'm part of a much bigger family with whom I share history, and I share a father, and I share a purpose, can give us just a tenderness of spirit.
I love that phrase, the tenderness of spirit. That's, oh my goodness. I feel like if there's one thing that our world and our culture and our leadership probably needs a lot more of right now, it's just that, a tenderness of spirit. That's really beautiful. You're obviously a wordsmith. I love the way that you use words and language. It's beautiful and it's poetic, and I love it. Speaking of words, one of the other words that you use, so you talked about this kind of global experience that you have. And then you also talked about the other thing you bring to the table is the relationship between, men and women and how we can lead together. And you use the phrase mansplaining when someone mansplains you. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand what that is. So can you explain and describe for us what mansplaining is?
Oh man, I feel like I'm stepping on a landmine here. Okay, so in my understanding, with no prep and not reading from a dictionary, I understand mansplaining to be that situation where a woman says something and it either doesn't get noticed, recognized, or acknowledged to move the conversation forward. And then next thing, a guy in the room, usually meaning well, says the same thing. And everybody goes, "Oh, that's great," as if the woman needed to be explained, as if she needed subtitles. It happens all the time. I mean, I tease my husband when he does it. And he's being helpful. But at much more serious and egregious levels, I think that can be one of the things that stops women from participating in meetings, because they think, I literally just said that. Can you hear me? Do I need to do a sound check on my voice? Yeah.
And so, and absolutely. And I think I love what you said too, that it's, often with good intention. It's not always coming from a negative place internally, but I think it's one of those things that we can often be really blind to. And when we say, hey, we want diversity in our team, we want to affirm and honor women and their voices in leadership, I think a lot of times we don't really know how to do that. We don't know what that actually looks like. And oftentimes, even when women do have a seat and a voice at the table, they're still entering a very, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but a very male-dominated atmosphere and conversation. It's been oftentimes very much, it's only been men. And so it's set up for men. And so there's a difference between equality and equity. And I think, we give people a seat and a voice at the table and say, hey, we're honoring equality and we're affirming that. And yet we're not actually giving equity, which means, we're not dismantling the entire atmosphere or establishment in order to actually rebuild it with women as key players and key voices. And so it's really easy for these situations to happen, for mansplaining to occur. What are some of the things that women can do? I want to ask, both. What are some of the things that women can do to establish their voice and to be heard in a way that is, honoring of everyone that's around them? And how can they really own their leadership and the seat that they've been given at the table? And then the other question is, how do the men in the room be aware of what it requires for a woman to actually have a voice that's heard? How can we both, kind of men and women alike, be part of building that equity?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to answer those backwards.
Okay.
I think that I'm seeing some men just really do this very beautifully in my own context, of making it a point to ask the women to engage, to say, we haven't heard from Joan at the table. What do you think? To make sure that someone doesn't interrupt them, to defer to them sometimes, because there can just be cultural ways of being at a table where men are quick to jump in and sometimes many women will hold back. And so men holding space is a beautiful way that I've seen that done, and actually inviting or soliciting feedback, making sure that they're heard at the meeting. There are practical things that go along with that as well, arranging meetings in places and times that are accessible. For women who are often juggling a lot of things, I think goes along with that. And I'm seeing some really great examples in our communities of my brothers saying, hey, don't speak to her like that. She was talking. Please don't interrupt. Let her finish. And I think that that's great. So lots of examples of men passing the mic.
Yeah.
What women, I think, could be better at doing is when someone passes them the mic, actually taking it and speaking into it. And one of the things I've noticed in myself, and I don't know where this came from, but I, along with many other women, do this, is that we have a habit or a tendency to discredit what we're saying before we say it. We say, well, I just have this thought, or if I could just add one thing, or I hope I'm not repeating myself, but, well, I'm sorry if, and we qualify what we're going to say. We put just in front of, and it minimizes what we're going to say before it comes out of our mouths. And I'm trying really hard to train myself out of the habit of doing that and to encourage other women not to say that, because, or we even, it's as simple as, well, I think that, or in my opinion, this, where what they're stating often is a fact. It's a fact that this is happening, not just an opinion that I think that this is the situation. This is the situation. And so being aware of my ability to sometimes qualify or hold back or diminish what I'm going to say, that's not the guys at the table's fault if they treated it just as a mere opinion, if I stated it as a mere opinion. So it's like taking your own stuff seriously. And then there are times of just leaning into and being encouraged that the different capacities that we bring, the different smarts that we bring to the table matter, that there's intuitive wisdom, that there's temporal wisdom of knowing sometimes the timing of a situation, of spatial wisdom, like all of those voices actually matter, and realizing that those are competencies that might be hidden, and not just natural talents behind us, but actually that those are strengths that we bring to the table. And education is really helpful this way. Irene Fambro has been doing some great work on different multiple intelligences. It's so exciting to me in terms of empowering women in leadership, because they are smart often, women are smart, and men, in so many ways that aren't often recognized, and then realizing, oh, this is actually a gift, this is a strength. I will take that mic, I have something to say. Is part of the capacity building.
Yeah. Is there a particular resource that you might recommend for somebody who says, gosh, I'd really love to dig into this a little bit more? This feels very relevant for me right now.
I'll send you the link in the show notes. I can't tell it to you on, but it's multiple intelligences. Okay. And actually I have a whole Propel Sophia series coming out with her on this in the next couple of months. So we'll have links to that too.
That's great. The timing is perfect. Yeah, we'll link all of that in the show notes because I think that could be so helpful and just resonate with so many leaders, men and women alike, who are saying, gosh, I really do want to honor and affirm my brothers and sisters and see us working together. And so you mentioned that being a huge part of your passion and experience right now. Does that play into the book that you have coming out?
Yes, it does. My book is called Beyond Awkward Side Hugs, and it is about living as Christian brothers and sisters in a sex-crazed world. Mm-hmm. And my book is really for church communities, which includes leaders, but is not exclusive to leaders. I think when you're talking about men and women in leadership, you're not just dealing with male-female dynamics, you're also dealing with power dynamics, and that's a whole different matrix of how we relate to one another. But this is just the general, can men and women be friends? When you get married, how does that change the way that you deal with the men and women around you? If you're dating, how does that change the way that you approach church community? And I just have observed so much fear in the States, and I guess beyond, but particularly in the States, of people thinking, gosh, things could really go wrong between men and women, so we should just stay away from one another. Because there's all sorts of the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement and marital infidelity and relationships are being broken and there are sexual predators in the church and it's just safer to keep everyone apart, kind of as a response. And it is great for us to be aware of the dangers of sin. That's important. We don't want to be blasé about our weakness, but at the same time, withdrawing from community and siloing us is not living as the family that God called us to be. And so this book is about what does it mean for us to really think about functioning as a family? Because we don't just stop talking to our brothers. There's time for a girls' day and there's time for a guys' day, but then we all need to get back together around the table and get on with the family business. And so what does that look like in our church contexts? That's what the book's about.
I love that. What really, and I know you mentioned some of what you've seen, especially in the U.S. with what's happening. Was that kind of the inspiration, or what really brought you to say, you know what, this is the book that I need to write right
now? It was actually other people that said to me, you need to write this book, rather than me thinking it was something. My husband and I have been involved in college ministry. I've been involved with women's ministry and pastoral ministry, but we together have done college ministry, youth ministry, and then young adults ministry for the last 20 years. And we have had, at this point, hundreds of people come through our house, and they all want to talk about relationships. Mm-hmm. And they have questions about dating and being engaged and being married. And this person is in my life and is sending me texts, and should I respond to them? And this is what's happening with my husband, and how should I respond? And it just became a theme over the years of me thinking, gosh, we've got to have better answers for people than just don't talk about sex, don't talk about sexuality. Just like it almost, I realized over the years that there were just so many messages people were getting that was like, when it comes to sex, don't. Mm-hmm. Like your sole job in interacting with the other sex is to find a spouse. Then you find that spouse, and then basically you never talk to members of the other sex again. That is just like the safest way to do it. Like you find the one and then you get married so that you don't burn, and then you shun everybody else because that keeps relationships and communities safe. And that's really an isolating way to live. I mean, God has more purpose for us than marriage. Mm-hmm. Many people in the church don't marry, and we still have to work with the men and women around us. But if we have this hypersexualized way of thinking that the only, because this is the subtext, right? The subtext is whenever men and women interact, there's always going to be sexual tension. Mm-hmm. That's like the Freudian subtext of it. It's what we see in movies and TV and songs, guy meets girl, and then it's really just a question of time, and either they get together and everybody's excited, or they get together and everything falls apart. But what's the same in that narrative is that we're assuming that there's only way that one way that men and women can be together, and that's with explosive chemistry, either good fireworks or bad TNT. And I reject that. Just with more people coming into my house, I thought, no, God has given us a bunch of ways to be men and women that doesn't involve getting naked. How about the fact that he calls us brothers and sisters? Like we can just do a whole bunch of life and community and love and leadership and partnership with our clothes on as men and women around. God has actually given us in the scripture a framework for living this life.
Yeah.
Motivated by love, not by fear of things going wrong. And so I had started out, just kind of being zealous on behalf of all of the brokenhearted and confused people that were coming through my house, and thinking, dang it, did nobody ever tell you that you could, talk to this girl that you like, because she's your sister. You don't have to date her. Like, you could just talk to her and it would be fine. So I was had this holy jealousy about writing it. But the more I got to write it, I thought, no, God is inviting us into something here. He calls us his family. He calls us his children. He addresses us as the Adelphoi of Christ. We are brothers and sisters together. All of the ethical instructions in the New Testament are not just written to individual believers. They're written to families. And we've just done so little thinking about what it means to belong to one another as his children. And I think it really changes the way that I felt about men and women in the church, because we all want to belong. And we want to belong as men and women, and God has invited us to do that. So we could stand to grow into his vision for us and how he sees us as the church.
I love, it sounds like, and you can, kind of correct where I'm mishearing you here, but it sounds like you're really doing an amazing job in this book of addressing fear. And I feel like, fear is whatever we can be given a fear of is the enemy's way of keeping us quiet and silent and divided. And if we can be divided because of our fear of how we're supposed to relate to one another, then like you said, we're not doing our kingdom work. We're not entering into the family business that we're supposed to be doing, that we're invited to do as brothers and sisters. And so I love how it sounds like you're just dismantling all of the fear of, mixed gender relationships and abuse too, because it's not just fear. I mean, there's legitimate abuse that has happened and because of that type of experience, in an abusive experience or an unfortunate heartbreaking experience, we can then develop the walls of fear and isolation like you talked about. But I love how you just need to be dismantling all of that so that we can actually live into the fullness of what we were created for.
I think that's totally right, because we need character and wisdom, not just caution tape. I use the analogy of like a dog that could bite someone, but the safest dog is not the dog on the shortest leash. The safest dog is the one that's the best trained. And so I think the call for us is not just to shorten everybody's leashes so that they don't interact, but for us to think, what is the work we need to do to grow in our character and wisdom so that we become safe people to be around?
I love that analogy. I really want the book now. I can't wait to get it in my hands. I mean, I'm thinking not only as a leader and as a pastor and as someone who has influence over, other people, but even just with my own children, even just in raising little humans up into the fullness of their identity and their purpose and their capacity. I mean, this just feels like a very pertinent, relevant, multi-generational, multicultural, necessary piece of work.
I hope so. And there's a shift in the way we train our children, isn't there? Mm-hmm. Like when they're really, really little, we do say, just don't touch. Just don't touch. Don't run in the road. Don't touch, it's hot. But there's a shift we want to make as they grow older that's not just about conforming to some external standard, but actually helping them internalize the reasons behind that so that they themselves have the wisdom to make good choices and can read the room, can look at the traffic, can test the temperature of the situation that they're walking into. Those are maturity questions. There is a time for beginner people, for little people and for baby believers where rules keeps us safe. But Galatians talks about, the Lord leading us in tutelage to a place where faith and freedom and character and the fruit of the Spirit really, again, do the work. It's much harder work, but it's free work.
It is. That's so good. And so as we're kind of wrapping things up, and obviously I want everyone to grab this book. I can't wait to get my hands on it. I want everyone to grab it and read it because, like I said,
it's green and it has knees on it. if you're wondering what it looks like, I will show you. Look, it's
Awesome.
green.
Oh.
And it has like a bunch of knees on the top, so you'll know what to look out for.
I love it. That's perfect. And we will, are pre-sales available yet? Can we link that?
Yeah, they are.
The show notes? Perfect.
Sure.
Okay, great. We'll do that. If there was something, and obviously, you are going to dive into this deeper in the book, which I think everyone should just grab and read. But for right now, if you could just give a couple practical, someone who says, gosh, this resonates with me, whether because I've been through my own hurt or abuse or failed relationship or whatever, and I have closed myself off and siloed myself, or gosh, I'm really just trying to figure out how to relate to one another, to my brothers and sisters in Christ. And there's this whole overarching, issue of sexuality and what do I do with my sexuality? So if there was just a couple, practical words of wisdom, advice, encouragement that you would give for someone who says, I really want to begin walking in this growth and maturity and wisdom, what are just a couple things that you might offer?
Well, some of them have to do with I want to give people permission and encouragement to be community builders. And sometimes we just need someone to say, that's actually okay. And not only is it okay, it's good for you to welcome people, to initiate conversation, to initiate relationship. You can do that. It's okay. Go ahead. Maybe not now because everybody's kind of on lockdown and social distancing, but you can still connect with people even if you don't touch them. And to be unashamed about doing that. We don't have to be wallflowers. This is like church is not a middle school dance where you have to wait for someone
we do. I feel that awkwardness though,
Yeah. But you are the church. We are the church, and we get to make it hospitable. Instead of waiting for someone to welcome us, we can be the welcomers in whatever way is appropriate for our community and lifestyle. So part of it is giving permission. I think part of it is the personal work of us living a more embodied life and not being squeamish about that we're men and women in bodies. And some of us have a lot of work to do about just being okay and comfortable that God gave us bodies, that they're good, and that we are meant to live in them, love with them, serve the world with them, and not behave as if only our soul is the part that Jesus loves, right? If we're going to be the hands and feet with Jesus, we need to be totally okay with being physical beings. Now, that's somewhat mental work, but there are real practical things that we can do to do that. I think, for many people, yoga has been that kind of thing, but embodied practices, breathing, just paying attention to your breath, that the Holy Spirit dwells inside you. Even a 10-second breathing practice before we kick into prayer, of breathing in and being in our body, can do some work. And I know that seems really abstract in terms of how is this going to help me in the church, but it helps you to be comfortable in your own skin. And if we're wanting to be comfortable around the skins of others, part of the work we need to do is getting more comfortable in our own skin. And then there's good reading resources as well. Invite community, get comfortable in your own skin, do some reading.
Yeah, that's good. And that's super doable and practical too. I feel like we can easily grab onto those things. And just that invitation to get comfortable in our own skin is fantastic. I love it. I love it when we can give something practical and tangible and actually doable for people right where they are. And I think
it is work though.
Yeah.
I don't want to underestimate the fact that it really, and for some people, particularly if there's a trauma background, it's really hard work. But it's so important. And I've seen God do really amazing healing things as people sort of pay more attention to what their body is telling them and how God is inviting them to process and grow and heal with Him.
That's so good. That's really good. I'm really excited to read this book and to see the impact and the influence and the effect that it's going to have. I feel like this is it's a timely piece of work for us, especially as we see, kind of the direction that our culture does tend to go. So that's fantastic. I just want to, on behalf of everybody, just say thank you. Thank you for your time today. And also thank you for writing this. Thank you for doing the difficult work of actually following the passion and the influence and the wisdom that God has given you and finding a way in which you can share that with the world. I'm really excited for all of us to get to benefit from that.
Thank you so much for having me at the table. I really wish I could be passing you a bowl of ice cream right now.
Me too, because I would receive it gladly. That's great.
Thanks for listening to the Table Leadership Podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to the resources that were discussed at the table today and to connect with today's guest. Remember to subscribe to the Table Podcast and follow along on social media at The Table Leadership. Visit thetableleadership.com to learn more about current courses and coaching opportunities. And finally, you can connect with me, your host, at cyonedgerton.com or on social media at cyonedgerton. I look forward to the next time that you pull up a seat at the table.